So in our last video, we learned about how realists look at the prisoner's dilemma, and they come to that conclusion that we are, trapped in this perpetual um, security dilemma of mutual mistrust and hostility. Now, if you look at liberal theory, their main premise is that we have anarchy, they accept that, but we have something called regimes, and they help us to overcome that problem generated by anarchy. Now, regimes, the term regime has a bad connotation even in political science, but international regimes, that is a different game altogether. International regimes are basically agreements, conventions, different forms of accords between countries where they agree to cooperate on any single issue. Liberals also say, much like realists, that states are, rational units. They look out for themselves and they pursue competitive strategies, and that results in goods being bought and sold at an optimum price. So just like economics, an unrestrained market provides the most effective mechanism for economic goods, but it is not effective for public goods. Here, the market can't provide, and we're talking about market failure. And liberals say that here actors need to cooperate in international relations. So again, if you're looking at any country, in any country you have services picking up the garbage from your house. You have entire infrastructure, schools, universities, electric grid, internet, water, sewer. All of that is partly provided by government or by private providers, but ultimately it's the government providing that infrastructure. You have somebody policing the street, keeping you safe. All of that is done by the government. We do not have that in international relations. Here we have market failures. That any of these issues, security, communication, environment, these are market failures in international relations. And here liberal say that these are basically global issues, and cooperation here is needed rather than competition. So again, liberals also look at the prisoner's dilemma, and again, realists say, well, prisoner's dilemma, players are prone to cheating. It's seen as the more beneficial strategy to each player or prisoners. Now, liberals here disagree. Liberals focus on the iterated prisoner's dilemma, meaning that the prisoner's dilemma is played over and over again, and therefore states learn how to collaborate, states learn how to cooperate, and states appreciate that trying a collaborative strategy, in fact, is the most beneficial one in the long term. Now, you might have heard that expression or the term tit for tat. Tit for tat was many decades ago the winning strategy in a computer tournament. And in that computer tournament, that particular strategy rewarded good moves and punished bad moves. So as much as you'd like to defect every time, now if you defect every time and your opponent cooperates, it's zero sum and you will win. Now again, we learned that in the prisoner's dilemma, this is not the case. Most likely both will defect and will be worse off. In the iterated prisoner's dilemma, in the tit for tat strategy, it's the way around, that good moves are being rewarded and bad ones are being punished. Now, this is what liberals call the shadows of the future. Then in international relations, states will remember of how you acted in the past, whether you honored your obligations, whether you entered conventions in good faith, and whether you were subject to the same obligations they were to. And this is basically the evolution of cooperation, and that is codified in international relations in these international regimes. Now again, we have different regimes, security regimes. Looking at 1675, the treaty between Germany and France, that was basically an early convention against WMDs. We're looking at poison bullets back in the days. But this was what we now would call WMD convention. Looking at the partial test ban treaty, SALT I and SALT II, strategic arms limitation talks between the Soviets and the United States. So any of these security regimes is basically making the world safer by agreeing in a mutual way, and it's all based on reciprocity, that states will not do something which makes the world a bit more insecure. So looking at reducing the number of missiles stock you have. And again, this is something which takes an awful lot of administration implementation. So looking at, you have your spies and you send them over that particular task force, and looking at that silo, whether, and looking at that particular facility, whether that country has in fact honored that obligation, and then the Soviets will come up with the US and see whether US in fact has done that. So this is a very lengthy process, but it's based on complete reciprocity. These are the shadows of the future, using a iterated game theory, iterated prisoner's dilemma term here. International Atomic Energy Agency is now a proper organization, but this was based on the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1986, the NPT, as it says here, from 1986, in which countries say, well, we want nuclear energy for civilian purposes, for energy, but we'll commit ourselves never to have nuclear weapons. And the International Atomic Energy Agency, based in Vienna now, is the entire watchdog, the nuclear watchdog, which makes sure that countries in fact honor that obligation. We have different environmental regimes, lots of different environmental regimes, basically telling states, and states again subject themselves to, by entering that regime, that they will not reduce the, looking at CO2 emissions in the Kyoto Protocol, for example. Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, that you will ban the hunting of any of these animals incorporated in that convention. Communication regimes, looking at Universal Postal Union, that goes back to 1863. That was as technical as if you send an envelope from Belgium to Norway, that it will be honored in Norway and on all the countries it goes through. So this was a very technical international telecommunication union, the ITU, International Civil Aviation Organization. So that basically is, if you get on a plane in Austria and fly to Canada, you will be able to land and you won't crash into other planes. So this things which we take for granted because it affects our everyday life really are initially were regimes. All of these now are part of the United Nations, but they all started as a technical regime between countries. And also looking at economic regimes, IMF, that of course EU, these are all organizations. NAFTA, is an economic regime. The Channel Agreements of Tariffs of Trade, then morphed into the World Trade Organization. These are all economic regimes dealing with the issue of economic cooperation, and that usually has to do with reducing tariffs and regulations, so it would foster international export and imports between member states. But you see that liberals point to the entire body of regimes as a way of showing, well, this is how we get along. It might be a scary world out there, but we have plenty of evidence that states found ways of cooperating and not going to war and not resorting to violence.